Lerita, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to speak with me for Richard Rohr's Daily Meditations. For readers that are unfamiliar with Lerita's work, Lerita Coleman Brown is a spiritual director, and she's the author of the book, What Makes You Come Alive? A Spiritual Walk with Howard Thurman. And this is a wonderful introduction to the spirituality and witness of Howard Thurman. My name is Mark. I manage our publications here at the Center for Action and Contemplation, which includes the Daily Meditations. So first of all, before we jump in, thanks so much for being here, Lerita, and lending your time and expertise.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It is just such a joy to be connected with the CAC, and I've been a follower for years, and so I'm just delighted to be actually talking on it today.
That's great. Well, I want to jump right into Howard Thurman, and we've found it an inspiring book to use for the daily meditations because it's very accessible for people who might not be familiar with Howard Thurman, but then it also does go pretty deep into what his witness and wisdom is. So with the readers of the DMs, we call them DMs, I'm sure there's a wide variety of familiarity with who Howard Thurman is. Some will be very familiar, others not so much. So what are two things about Howard Thurman's life that you would like all the daily meditation readers to know?
Well, I think the two things that highlight his life are the fact that he believed that every person was a child of God. This was an idea, a notion passed on to him by his grandmother, Nancy Ambrose, and it became core to his identity, which was crucial. So, to think that you are a child of God as opposed to any other things that people might say about you and that you would internalize as your self-concept, to know that you are a child of God is extraordinary. And I think he found that it really helped people to accept that as part of who they were. And I should also mention, though, that he believed that every person was a child of God, which means that would include people that you detest. So that's a little caveat. And the second thing is that I would say around 7 or 8 years old, Howard Thurman started meditating, or what he later found was meditation, with his back against an oak tree in his yard. And he realized then that it was so important to find some time in every day to quiet your mind and to connect with God. And he felt that it was just so important for our spiritual development and for our gaining the awareness of our connections to all of creation.
Well, thank you for that. I can already hear many overlaps with Father Richard Rohr's teaching and on the true self is your beloved nature in God, and that is both the most radical and unifying identity that shows us who we are and how we're connected to all reality and all people. So thank you for that. I love the title of your book, What Makes You Come Alive. I find it very stirring, and discovering aliveness is very important to Howard Thurman. He's got that wonderful quote, don't ask what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive, and go do it. So can you explain a little bit about what aliveness is for Howard Thurman?
Certainly. He, was a keen observer of nature. As a matter of fact, he spent a lot of time outside as a young boy. And he noticed that even in, winter, that there were these cycles of life that you could observe. And even in winter, you had these plants and trees and things that looked sort of dead, but he understood that there was something alive in them, preparing them for the beginning of spring. And so as he observed all kinds of, animals and, just the cycle of day and night, that there was something, almost like an aliveness in everything, including us. and that what happens is that when we feel this sense of aliveness, we are able to be as beautiful as a spring day, or as or a flower just emerging, from the bud. And so he really wanted people to understand that this aliveness was in each of us, and he felt that it was so important for people to engage in their passions, or to engage in activities that delight their spirits, or to follow a vocational path that would light you up every time you talked about it. And so that was the kind of aliveness that he felt that we all need, that we need in the world, that having more and more people who are not just doing the same old routine, but that they are also participating in a very vital way in the ongoing creation. He felt it was still happening.
Wow. I find that so insightful, that ecological aliveness is connected to our aliveness and living out our own vocation. It's a lot there.
Oh, yes. Yes, and he even, felt like that there was some kind of, common connection among animals and people, and that it was okay to go out and talk to your plants, and that, other animals, he loved penguins. So there are lots of the sense of connection to other beings in the world besides, people.
Gosh, I'm hearing a lot of resonance with Franciscan ecological focus, as well as Thurman's, I guess you could call it nature mysticism, or finding God in nature. That's great.
Yeah. It's so funny, because as you read some of these things, you get to that place where you realize they're all saying the same thing, but in different ways and at different times. It's almost as if the message is being repeated, so if we hear it enough, we might get it.
Yeah, if we hear it enough through many different lenses and perspectives. Yeah. Well, let me ask you another question. Every year for the Daily Meditations, we choose an annual theme. And this year, our theme for the year is radical resilience. And so we're taking each quarter, we're leading people through a journey of discovering the deep spirituality that leads us towards radical resilience, to discover radical resilience. Could you share a story or a time in Howard Thurman's life when he showed what you might describe as a type of radical resilience?
Yeah, when I was thinking about radical resilience the other day, and there are a few times. I mean, he lost his father when he was 7. He was criticized for leaving Howard University to start this new Church of the Fellowship of All Peoples that was interfaith and interracial, intentionally non-denominational. And he was also, people were upset when he left that church to go become the first black faculty member and dean of the Marsh Chapel at Boston University. But I think perhaps maybe the one that comes to mind is while he was at Boston University, he was very keen on trying to create a space there for an interfaith welcoming. So he wanted to make sure that everybody, Christians, Muslims, Jewish people, whatever your faith, you could come to the chapel and feel at home. And so he had a sort of a chapel project that he had been working on for several years, and the Board of Trustees voted it down. It was a Methodist University, and they weren't quite ready in the, I would say late 1950s, early 60s for that kind of interfaith connection. And I think he was just devastated by it. But what you see in his life is this idea of use of inner authority, right? Knowing that you have agency to say yes or no, and to decide what you're going to do next, et cetera. And inner authority, that with the capital I and the capital A, which, I just love Father Richard Rohr's, renditions of that. But I think he took some time away, did some traveling, and then he retired, but not really retired. But he stepped away from that position, and began to lecture, widely around the world, as well as to start the Howard Thurman Educational Trust to make sure that other poor children like himself, his family, didn't have much money, were able to go to school and get through that. So it's one of those kind of things of where you get sort of knocked down, but through, I think, in his case, discernment, and through this kind of practice of inner authority, which he had been using all this time, right? People criticize him. He prays, makes a decision. And so, it was through that he was able to then put his life back together and say, okay, I'm going to continue to do this work. It's just not going to be at Boston University. And, and I think at that time, too, I mean, to think about how old he was at that point, and what he might do. But he wrote several books after that too, as well. So it didn't stop him.
Wow, so ahead of his time. Maybe I could ask you this for readers that are newer to Howard Thurman. What are 2 or 3 ways that he broke a tradition and was far ahead of his time? I think of one as creating the house, the Interfaith Church in San Francisco, first interracial interfaith church in the United States. What else would you say? Maybe 1 or 2 examples of ways he broke boundaries and created something new, way ahead of his time.
Well, he wrote about mysticism in the 1930s, right? Here's this black man emerging from the Baptist tradition, writing about mysticism. So, and of course he got highly criticized for that as well. People saying, we need tools for liberation. What's this mysticism stuff, right? So, and then I think that his work in that area of his book, The Creative Encounter, which he wrote, I think, in the late 50s, talks about neurotheology, but he doesn't use those terms. That every time we connect with God, it should be changing us somehow. And perhaps at some point that will be, result in a change of behavior. But, to go to a predominantly white seminary, he came out of Morehouse College and went there. To then take a semester off at some point and study with Rufus Jones, the Quaker mystic. I mean, he was just doing stuff all over the place. The other thing too was that people tried to write him off because he didn't have a PhD. And they were like, but Thurman basically said, I'm really not interested in studying things that I'm not interested, that don't interest me, that I'm not excited about, that doesn't bring me alive, right? So he was very, he was sort of very led to, things like, he read the book by Rufus Jones and thought, I need to go study with this man. I didn't even know that there was such a thing as mysticism. So to think that somebody was talking like this or writing like this, in the 40s and then later in the 70s, it's just unheard of. And especially a black man. It's not. So way ahead of his time in terms of also making this connection between contemplation and action, or, mysticism and social change, etc.
Wow, he's such an inspiring figure. I want to ask you this last question about mysticism and social change, because that connection was very important for him. And I'm speaking from the CAC. Well, I'm in Massachusetts, but I'm speaking remotely from the CAC, the Center for Action and Contemplation. Can you say more about what that connection was for Howard Thurman, how mysticism was a source for social change?
Yes. Well, so the first thing is that Thurman tried to destigmatize the term mysticism or mystic, because every time you would bring it up, people would start talking about the occult or something, and he just felt the need to clear that up and to talk about different types of mystics. They're not all the same. And then second, he basically, and I think this was connected to not only his studies with Rufus Jones, but also with his own personal experience. And that was this idea that when you go inside to God, you come up in oneness or community. He used the word community, but it was oneness. And that as we have these creative encounters, so let's not call it mystical encounter, let's call it a creative encounter or a religious experience. We have this, we develop this expanding awareness that somehow we are connected to other people, and this urge to eliminate the barriers that have been imposed, denominational barriers or racial barriers or whatever is keeping us. He basically would say, whatever is keeping people from God or from each other requires social action. So, if we really believe that every person was a child of God and therefore holy, we wouldn't be doing some of the things that we do to people or saying some of the things that we say to people. But it was this idea that by connecting with God on a regular basis, our spirits are strengthened. We come to know ourselves better. Like an accurate portrayal, not what people told you who you are, but something that emerges from you. We're sort of encouraged, that is, to have the courage to then resist injustices wherever you see them. And to begin to listen to the spirit about whatever your role happens to be in this ongoing sort of reconciliation of, or bringing back together this kind of one creation. And I think that the really important sort of aspect to that is that it is so important to realize that your spiritual practices, your spiritual life, are not just for you. And I think that Thurman sort of believed that we all need to make a contribution to restoring, to the restoration of God's beloved creation. And perhaps maybe that's why we're here in whatever form that, manifest. But he wanted people to sort of be mindful of what they were doing, not doing it because it's the latest thing to do, but doing something. He had a conversation with Jesse Jackson and asked him, well, but who are you really? Right? Really, asking those kind of probing questions. And later he wrote about developing a working paper. Everybody needs to have a working paper. And as I read it, it's very similar to a rule of life. So some groups have rules of life. Some people have rules of life. In his case, he thought a working paper would be appropriate. And there are two unpublished manuscripts in a latest installment of a sermon series. And this one is called The Inner Life and Social Responsibility. So he was very high on world-mindedness. That is, when you are about to do something or make a decision, who else is this going to impact?
I love that idea that our spiritual practices are not for us, they're for everybody. It's for the world, and that compelling us to join in social action as we understand it for the common good.
Yes. Very much a person who felt called throughout his life. It wasn't always the same call. And following that. And it's a challenge, but I think, if we can sort of engage in our practices, our spiritual practices on a regular basis, and listen deeply. He was high on communal silence. He really, that was part of his worship service. He felt like it was healing and enlightening, sort of illuminating, answers to questions that people had. And when he introduced that in his service in San Francisco, requests for pastoral counseling went down.
Mm. Well, that's it's an inspiring invitation for us to continue with contemplative practice. And if we don't have a practice, to start one today. Because we won't be the same and the world won't be the same. Lerita, thank you so much for just sharing a little bit about your work and about the wisdom and life of Howard Thurman. Really appreciate you taking the time today.
Well, thank you so much. It's just been a joy. It's always a joy to be able to talk about him and his, I call it living wisdom because it's still feeding us many years after his death.